quick audio testing. Some quick test. And we're still testing.
Good. Let me hear my voice now. Sweet. All
Okay.
right, we're good.
Alrighty. Well, welcome to the anime podcast. The 2021 Spring Gauntlet, week 12, the final week. We have reached the finish line. And now we just have, essentially, between this week and next week, the crowning of the Gauntlet champion and awards, seasonal anime awards. And yeah, it's crazy that we've come so far. Some great shows, some not so great shows, but yeah, we're finally at the end of the spring season.
Yeah, so we only have 8 shows left because 86 had their last episode last week. So only 3 shows will be technically considered safe. And I went ahead and if you go on to the next slide, I already
Okay.
called them Gauntlet Survivors
Yep.
because they are. And
Yeah.
only the next 3 are for sure guaranteed since the bottom 5 are in the drop list. So without further ado, we can go on to number 1, which is going to be Vivi Floret Ice Song. You'll notice that the score is a little bit different just because some of these shows had episodes number 12 and 13. So for my scores, I gave it a 6.6, and then for episode 13, 9.9, while John gave it a score of 7 and an 8. For rolling average of 7.80, I went up by 0.01. What are your thoughts on, I guess, this week's episode as well as like the
Yeah.
show in its entirety?
Yeah. I think the show in its entirety very there's a reason why I think it got the number 1 in our system. I think that overall, just in terms of quality, it was a very, very enjoyable show from start to finish. I think specifically for these episodes, I will admit and say I think this is almost just due to the story being so well constructed that essentially there was no surprises at all in the last 2 episodes.
Sure.
That being said, though, it does speak to the quality of the storyboarding. That essentially, like the arrival of what happens is still very emotionally impactful, and I guess from a storyboard perspective, very impactful, and yet. Like essentially, it makes sense that it gets to this point because they've built everything up like very intricately. I
Yeah.
think that this show, yeah, by far, I think if we were to look at it just overall, I mean, first of all, it's actually number 1 in our spots, but secondly, too, like just in terms of like quality and consistency, like this one's just all the way up there. I think just between like the animations, the audio, the music, the storyboarding, the characters is just extremely well rounded, and this does give me essentially I personally, after now I can confidently say now after having watched the entire show, I personally think that this show is at least within the same league as some like other incredible works like say like Violet Evergarden. I personally think that it's like of that level of quality where like it's just a very very good all around product, and it does like some aspects just like incredibly well. Yeah, what were your thoughts on series overall, and then I guess the episodes?
I think in terms of the ending of the show,
Yeah,
a little bit in the more predictable
yeah,
side. We
yes,
both kind of called how
yeah,
there has to be some sort of
yeah,
replay of memories
yeah,
for things to happen.
yeah,
And I guess the weak point I think of this ending is the believability that the last challenge, like the
yeah,
last conflict, is the archive giving Vivi
yeah.
like the reins
Incredible
of,
complete control.
yeah, which is like, I guess I
Yeah,
don't know how much I believe in that, right? We
yeah,
she did all of this just for
yeah,
that choice, and
yeah.
so
It
in terms of believability, it's kind of
Yeah.
meh.
Yeah. That's kind of what where my ratings, I'll be honest, a little bit kicked in, where it's kind of like, okay, okay. Let me put it like this. I still think from like a thematic element, it's like elegant enough to the point where I still think it's like decent. But okay, like
Yeah.
technically yes, like okay, of course, AIs will worship the first person that actually kind of went and did something of free will, because that's like the next level of existence. Like
Yeah.
from like a philosophy perspective, it makes sense, right? But it's like, especially I think the way the finale was handled does also remind you that, like, okay, if there's this much of worship, they've still went back and essentially made sure that all the past events didn't end up altering the timeline too much. They explicitly say
Yeah.
that, right? And then
Yeah.
essentially, they get another. Let me put it like this: like, I still think I understand that the show gives you like a mechanical explanation for how they go back in time, and for the most part, as a viewer, you don't really think about it too much. But I think that the butterfly effect, or lack thereof, of essentially her just going back in time and redoing essentially episode 12
Mm.
calls it a little bit more to attention. And I personally think it's like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, you might have wanted to like handle that a little bit more delicately, because if you're painting out the AI to be some sort of like crazy god that can like essentially intervene with what they know to be a time traveler, what makes it just like possible for Vivi to just walk in and just sing the song and just
Hmm.
end it all, right?
Yeah.
I do think that, like I said, like, it isn't completely inexcusable. And I still think that there's kind of like a there is like a there is a finality, like thematically speaking, that I think like does well. I personally, I think this may have been part of like kind of by design. I personally also thought too that like essentially there's a lot of emotional buildup, but like it's just like the lights go black and it's just done. And like I
Yeah.
get that, like there's a tiny part of me that like wished we could see kind of like more of like, okay, so what did this sacrifice do, that type of stuff. But at the same time, I
Wait,
do
did you see?
understand
Did
that.
you see the after credit scene?
Wait, what was the after credits? If you start describing a little bit, I like feel like
Well,
I saw an after credits scenes.
yeah. So I mean, technically, yes, it did black out, but the after credit scene, Vivi
Oh
is
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah,
at
yeah.
a
Sorry.
museum.
Yeah, yeah, at the museum, and they go, oh, like you want
Yeah.
to perform. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
technically, okay, so technically, there's some part of her that's still alive.
Yeah.
And she's now like a songstress, but it sounds like, this Vivi doesn't isn't
Have
the
free
yeah
will
have
because the whole shtick is that the
yeah,
reason why she was given the choice is because she had free will, right? And
yeah,
so, in order for this to not happen again, she can't have free will.
yeah,
Was my understanding.
yeah. And so it's like
Yeah.
it's kind of like it's not really Vivi anymore.
Yeah,
um
which is no sad, right?
yeah,
But I think in terms of the build up, like the
yeah,
journey of it all, it was a
yeah,
great watch. I
incredibly,
think
yeah.
I
Hmm.
think back about all the battles and the moments, and I
Yeah,
feel it.
yeah,
And I want to make that as a point because there's
yeah.
another show here where I think
The opposite.
didn't do that so well.
Okay,
Yeah, but
okay,
that's down the list.
okay. Alrighty. And at number two, we have those Snow White notes. Stayed at number two. Minatsu gave a score of 9.4. I gave it a score of 8. I think this may have been the biggest differential that this show has gotten in terms of boost from you versus me. The rolling average.
We actually said that before.
Okay.
But you go ahead and do
Okay.
the
And
rolling average.
the rolling average is now raised by 0.14 to breach the 7 quite handily. And now we are at 7.13. So, yeah, I think that this show's finale. First of all, I can't say the same thing about this show versus Vivi, where I say like the quality is just super consistent throughout. But I will say that I think, given the slice of life parameters, I think that it was handled very beautifully. I think that at the end, at least from an emotional catharsis, like a catharsis, like it's all there. Like I think that there is definitely, as a viewer, I'm just gonna be honest, there was a very huge part of me that's like, ugh, like I feel like I like didn't get enough. I wanted more. I wanted more story closure and all that. And technically, yes, especially with the very ending frames being like him going putting his hand forward, right, and like grabbing the what is the shamisen, grabbing the shamisen, like it's just like, okay, yes, like clearly like it's set up for a sequel. And so if you were to take it from that type of a lens, I do think that the show's ending was pretty well done. If I recall correctly, based on information I got from Manatsu, this show's manga source material is still going on. There's over 50 plus chapters, so there's still plenty of material to go over. And so yeah, I mean, I think that it's I haven't. I'll admit that I personally haven't watched a lot of music animes. This is actually the first one I think where like the focus has been this heavy on music. And it's I guess more on a serious tone. But I will say that like for all the I guess kind of the slow moments and kind of like the very slice of life kind of like things you just have to wait through, this show ended up being very emotionally sound, even if it's cliche. I do think that like it ended up kind of like rocking some of the strings of my heart, so to speak. What did you think of the final episode?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do watch a lot of these musical animes.
Okay.
It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I love, and the bar
Mm-hmm.
that I always set for
Mm-hmm.
me is the show, The Sound of Music.
Yeah.
I forget the
Okay.
name.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like this final episode. I think
Yeah.
it was necessary for him
Mm-hmm.
to lose.
Yes.
I like that the journey now is converting a bit
Yes.
to him wanting to win. Like he
Yes.
starts to have this drive.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm on the same park with you in terms of I want to see that. Like I want to see
Yeah.
the continuation.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there's no season 2 announced yet. Although there's I think enough content for like 3 more
Yeah.
seasons.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that, I feel like there's a long journey ahead of him. We just kind of barely scratched the surface. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind if like he already passed his phase with these kids and is like
Yes.
moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Um,
I
I
I
always think that journey is great to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that I'm very excited for him to move on from these kids. Like they can still be like IRL friends, but like have him start interacting, with the glasses
Yeah,
senpai, right? Having him
the
start,
yeah, exactly.
have him start interacting, with the first place guy, right? Like have him start interacting with, what sounds like I can't say if it's illegitimate, but definitely kind of children of not
Oh yeah,
same
yeah.
father mother pairing as him.
Mm-hmm.
So those other people, right? Like the girl that envies him so much. Like I want to see like more like interactions between him and musicians, right? And I think that like
Exactly.
it was like I think both of us can agree that like this show the most I guess if we were to knock off points for like the show in its entirety, it's definitely like a little bit too much of a focus on slice of life where it's just like oh like this is just legitimately the same like Japanese classroom shenanigans where you pan the camera from the doorway and just watch them do
Yeah.
like that type of stuff, right? It's like it's too common. But like I'll be honest and say that I think that the way this show is set up, it can only go so much uphill now that we've essentially kind of cleared like this school, like the
Yeah.
what I would imagine like to be like potential avenues for the studio to be like let's focus on slice of life because like from now on it's going to be about him with his mechanical improvement, right, with his drive to actually become a shamisen player. In the past, right, like he's a shamisen player purely within the context of his love for his grandpa, right? And now it's like he wants to achieve greatness, and it's like that's like sure maybe a tiny bit shonen-y, but like still like incredibly. I think just always that was always kind of like the draw of the show. I think that the parts that ended up emotionally resonating with you the most in this show have always been about the music, right? The first episode, like holy shit, like he performs like at that thingamajig, like at the nighttime
Mm-hmm.
performance, like just like it's unbelievable. Like you watch like him and his performance, like with the two different emotions, like just all of it. I think that the studio does a very good job, I personally think, of bringing, shall we say, the transition from like a manga storyline and panels and bring it to an anime format. I'm not gonna say that there weren't plenty of still shots, there weren't plenty of whatever, but I do think that for the moments that mattered the most, like it was a very enjoyable like animation viewing experience. And yeah, honestly, I'm just incredibly excited for next seasons. I really hope they get a next season. I'm not sure exactly how it was received in Japan, but at least for me personally, like this one did end up with the number two rolling average. I think for good reason because its highs were just very incredible.
It's interesting you point that out because I think what one of the things I think they did terribly
Yeah.
was the animations during the peak moments.
Interesting. I thought
Because
it was
I I thought it was really bad because there was the artwork was just so off during those moments too. I think they did better towards the last few episodes,
yeah.
but I think in terms of first half, it was just a bit not the best. Like I always compare it to Kono to Tomare, and
Okay.
I always like looked at that as a standard, and I
Okay.
just like I wish those Snow White Notes could hit that mark, but
I
I
see.
it could be because I've watched a ton of these kinds of shows, but
Okay. Yeah, I will say too that I'll just be honest and say that I'm not sure I can imagine this show as a manga too, just because like it's so much about sound. It's like how does this type of a story actually come alive in like a manga panel? It's kind of surprising to me.
oh, it
And I feel
actually
like
it actually works out. So the
yeah,
anime that I talked about previously, I
yeah,
actually read first as a manga, and then
okay,
I heard it that they converted to the anime. I was like, oh, that's
hmm
cool, and then you realize like, oh my goodness, it's even better as an anime.
yeah, right. Like I can't like obviously this is me like having the perspective of watching the anime first, right,
Mm-hmm.
and then like not having read the manga yet, but I can't imagine going to like a manga and reading this story without the sounds, because I do think that sure I'm not I'll be honest, right, like all my musical training comes in like a western music. I don't have any training in eastern music, but like just listening to the sounds and stuff like that, it's like, oh, like it seems at least like relatively coherent versus like the dialogue they're talking about. I do think that like whoever they contracted for doing composing and then subsequently performing, like it like hit the mark enough to the point where like you feel emotional waves. At least for me, I did, and so that was like I thought that was pretty great. Um, but yeah, those Snow White Notes, I think in big retrospect, it's a show that definitely has its highs and its lows. It's not like some genre transcending stuff, but I do think that just from like it's a pleasant watch. I think it's a pleasant watch, and you definitely you coming into I guess like a slice of life music story that's supposed to be like it's the vibe you get from looking at the posters and the storyline, right? The story being set up by like the death of a family member. It's like, oh, like you are expecting there to be like decent like emotional moments, and I do think that for the emotional moments, for the most part, they've delivered well enough for me to consider it satisfying. Is it like mind breaking? Like absolutely not, but like you know, still quite solid. I guess the biggest summary or the biggest thoughts I have of this show is just like I can't wait for the next season, and I think that like this season, the way they set it up like sets up incredibly like a next season. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Alrighty. And the last member of
Safe,
the
yeah.
contenders is
Odd Taxi at number 3. It went up by 1 spot. I gave a score of 7 and 10.1, which is my highest score of this week. And you gave a score of 8 and 11, which is your highest score this week. And to all the viewers, 11 is the highest score we can ever give a show. So that is the first episode, perfect
yeah.
episode, so as to speak,
Yes.
we've given
Mm-hmm.
in this podcast. For rolling average of 7.05, so it has broken the 7 barrier. So it went up by 0.36.
Yeah.
Oh my
Um.
goodness. The show the ending was spectacular. You can
I.
see that
Yeah.
in the penultimate scorings, we gave it an okay score, right? 7 and
Yeah.
8, like
Mm-hmm.
pretty well done.
Yeah.
But it's that final episode that just broke a lot of things. There's
Yeah.
so many things
I
to unpack, but
It's so incredible. I just for some context, us as anime watchers, there are news feeds, etc. Like sometimes, like we do get little smidgens here and there. We obviously won't like read into anything and spoil it. All these reactions are genuine, but we did see essentially this show before we watched the episode. We did see that this one ended up being number 45 on anime lists like all-time highest scores. If you were to actually essentially condense all the Gintama scores, because by the way there's like a crap ton of them out there, plus take out the movies, this ends up being number 25 on the list like of all-time animes. So when you see that, like obviously this show has been incredible. It's always been top. Okay, it's been top for a very long time. I think for most of the Gauntlet. And it's like it's really well done. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I was very surprised to hear that, because I heard that like, oh, it's like it's a decent show, but I didn't think of it as just absolutely transcending. And before we dive into all the details, which I just really want to dive into just because there's so much great stuff to uncover, like I can maybe through a little bit of recency bias, but like this genuinely, this last episode is like some of like the best TV I've watched in terms of like relative to like how it complements the rest of the story. Like this is a discussion that will be held later, but at least like I'm at the point where like I'm full send like agree with like the public opinion on this one. Like it's just incredible. So where do we even begin on what we want to unpack? Let's talk. Let's first talk, I guess, like the story as a whole in terms of the plot progression specifically. There's also animation choices. There's like like a big bunch of different choices. But let's just talk the mystery story first. So it's yeah, honestly, like just incredible. I think you have oh man, all the storylines finally coming to get together. There's a moment of convergence essentially where everyone's stories, right? Like whether it be the comedian brothers, whether it be the gacha addicted boy, whether it be Otakawa, the gangsters, um, everyone's story seemingly converges around this area near the water, right? And like it's this is one of the moments where like I think that like the elegance of kind of like how they wrap up the show to me felt really tear jerky and kind of like it felt very good to watch because I feel like it's like they've built up the stories well enough. This is kind of my perspective. They've built up each of these stories well enough that to have them kind of like all like have like a convergence moment doesn't feel like you're robbing them any out of any of the, shall I say, the storyline complexities, or shall I say, like it feels like, oh, like I wish we had more type of stuff. Like I feel like it wraps it up pretty nicely. What do you think of, I guess, like the plot progression?
Uh, I mean, I know the moment. So I thought it was nice.
Yeah.
Just to have it all there.
Yeah.
I think so one of the big things that I think shocked everyone was definitely his condition.
Yeah, the visual like
Right.
nausea thingamajig. Yeah.
Yeah, so he perceives humans as animals a lot because of the way he was bullied, right? And his
Yes.
love for his dad and the gift that his dad gave him, which was an animal encyclopedia.
Yes.
And so there's that first like reveal, which is like, wow. So let's talk about the minute details under that.
Yeah.
Minute details number one, the artwork.
Yes. It
So
goes from
from
blur. Yeah.
yes, okay,
Yeah.
from episode
Yeah.
1 to episode 13, when he is looking at animals, the background is all pastelly, all blurry.
Yes.
There's no solid lining, and
Yeah.
as we watch it, we just assume it's like the art style.
Stylistic.
We
Yeah.
kind of ignore it.
Yeah.
But it's all intentional because the moment he sees humans again, everything is sharp.
Yeah.
The colors contrast really sharply.
Yeah.
So then you realize, wow, that is a stylistic choice that they decided.
Yeah, it's like it speaks such a crazy tale. I think it's just so superbly well done. Like it's like
Yeah.
okay, like we go through the whole thing, right? Like the show's vibe, right? Even though the conversations were really visceral, very entertaining, very real. Like this is, like I said, like this is like the true masterclass on like how you do characters in conversation. Like you still take a lot. You still have to acknowledge that a lot of the show is incredibly stylized, right? And now when you look back, you realize that, oh, it's stylized because he's consistently trying to fill in the gaps, right? Like the art styles, some of
Yeah.
like like oh, like the animals, like being like like, oh, like this guy, because he's like an animal like this, he's supposed to act like this or whatever. Like it's all like him filling the gaps, right? And I think that there's like a double-edged beauty to it where like I think that like, or not necessarily double edged, but like just a double, like a 2-for-1 beauty of it, because like number one, we get to watch the show, right? And this is kind of a show point that I feel like me and Manatsu have brought up a decent amount, where if you use anthropomorphic animals in the show, it does have like a mechanical effect of allowing you to just kind of focus on who they are as like their characteristics, right? And less about who they are, like their physical appearance, and allowing that to go into play of that, right? And that's beautiful because that's exactly how I would argue that's kind of like why Otakawa is specifically the way that he is, right? The reason why he's so like, like crazily analytical and stuff like that, because he sees everyone as animals. He has nothing but essentially kind of like their essence, right? Like he sees them as animals, and like the other parts of him being able to interact with them is just like they're all animals, right? And so like we getting to see this stylized world through his lens, and then having that reveal, like to me is just like, oh my gosh, like it's so beautiful. Like it's like, damn, like it's
and it explains, so because one of the things that we were kind of like just believing
Yeah.
is his ability to pick someone out from a
Yes.
crowd,
Mhm.
and if we just like, okay, it's just his skill, but in
Yeah.
reality the reason why he can do that is because he sees everyone as animals.
Yeah,
And
so
so
it's
it's so
easier to
easy to
yeah.
pick out like a dog
Yeah.
from like a crowd of just
Yeah.
different animals. Like, oh, there's just one dog, and so it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that explains it.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of details. For example, one, like calling it Homo sapiens in a world, okay, in a world where they're supposed to be all animals, it doesn't make sense
Yeah,
why there would be a name called Homo sapiens. There's a hint there. There's also the hint of, okay, like if you're watching the beginning sequences, right? Like there's still, okay, the beginning sequences and actually some other elements, like essentially like, oh, like birds shitting on his taxi thingamajig, his
yeah,
taxi window, and trying to clean it up. It's like, okay, in a universe of animals, are there just less evolved animals? Like, you know, sometimes
yeah.
eating
There's a lot of
food. Yeah,
animals.
there's
Yeah,
there's actually a lot of like context clues now when you go back and you're like, oh shit, like this is actually like, you know, just like the way he sees the world, right? But like it's like, and even like for example, and just while we're on the point of I guess like talking about like mechanical storyline thingamajigs, the mystery, right? The way that he reacts to the
yeah,
mystery of what the cat was in the closet. I thought that was just so well done because he's legitimately a guy who feels like he's self-aware, right? That he's lost it because he never tells people that, oh, you're all animals, and in fact he's very like it's not like, oh, like he's like living in this world where he's in denial that everyone's humans, right? Because the moment he comes back, he goes, oh yeah, we're all humans. Like he understands like what the world is actually like, right? But like he's also like kind of like aware to the point where he wasn't sure the person in the closet was it actually a person that
actually,
he
a
was seeing
human
as an
being
animal
or an
or just an
animal. He
animal,
didn't
right?
know.
Yeah. And so I thought that was just like a nice little thing. But yeah, Molly, I think there's just like it's so good. I
It
just really
it's great.
yeah.
It's great that all of this can be explained with that one thing. Is
Yes.
how great the writing is. The fact that,
Yes.
oh, he has this condition
Yeah.
explains artwork. It explains his character. It explains the whole mystery and like the
Yeah.
tension
Yeah.
just because of that one explanation, and the way they've
Yeah.
done it is just so superb.
It's so incredible. I think that yeah, like and I think like, you know, when it comes to like just relational things too, like it's just like oh man, like I think like now in hindsight, right, like, you know, you have it's just so incredible to see like all these stories kind of like come to a close, whether it's, you know, whether it's his gorilla doctor, you know, his friend, like the like his romantic interest, like just watching all these things like come into convergence is just like I think like it's super satisfying because not only is there kind of like this absolute wow moment that comes from like, oh, this is his condition, slide it back in, like rewind the tapes, like it all like comes together, but it's also like just like the people, right? The people in this story are just so well done, and seeing like all their stories kind of wrap up, like it like felt incredibly warm inside. It's just like I think it just speaks like absolutely to like the testament truly of like how wow this show was done. I think that, like, you know, the mystery was entertaining enough to the point where actually now if I were to go back, I want to see a big bunch of like, you know, clues and stuff
Yeah,
like that just to see
and
like,
I'm pretty sure the show would have given some.
yeah, exactly, right? Like there's got to be context clues. Like there's like for those of you who don't know, there's actually even a side audio kind of like mini series that they released called like it's called like
Yeah,
something text.
so that's the
Yeah.
second part that I
Yeah.
wanted to talk about because
Yeah.
I didn't know about it till I read the Reddit
Yes.
comments in this
Yeah.
last post.
Mhm.
So apparently, there's a pen that has a transponder in
Yeah.
it, a
Mhm.
receiver in it, so that it
Yes.
records all the audio. And
Yeah.
apparently, it's been in the show for a while now.
Yes. If you go back, I will say I didn't go back and watch the entire show. I did go back and like watch like the last two episodes. Yeah, it's there. Like it's like holy shit.
Yeah.
Like it's
And
actually there.
so yeah, and so essentially what it is on YouTube on a separate account
Hmm.
owned by Taxi, of course.
Yes. Hmm.
They release snippets of what the pen has received,
Yeah.
all the audio. And the reason why that's important as well, why that is nice. One, it's a really nice little treat
Immersion.
for
Yeah.
those.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Number two, it helps kind of figure out what happened at the ending of the
Yes.
show,
Hmm.
which is
Yeah.
you realize because everything is solved except for the murder of the
Yes.
cat, and then we are revealed that it is the freaking fourth place person
Yeah. It's
who is the
actually
mastermind.
it's so like I don't know. I think it's like so, like it just makes so much. I think like once again like this like, the way that the murder was handled. I honestly think like it felt so good because like it's like I feel like this show just has such a good grasp on like essentially like believability, right? Like, because when I see like
Yeah,
what happens in the final episode, it's like, dude, this is Occam's razor. It makes so much freaking sense. Like this whole
yeah,
thing going crazy and all that. It's like, dude, like it just like yeah, completely. Like it's like I don't know, like it just consistently like my immersion in this, and my immersion and investment in this show's story has like just been honestly the highest. I think out of all the shows, even like for some of the other shows like where I can appreciate it a lot, I still view it like distinctly kind of as like a anime viewing experience. Like this is the one where like this is one of the shows where like I'm legitimately so into it. It's like, oh, like you could provide me with like, just a big bunch of like books and like author's notes, and I was just to pour like my heart into like just reading all them because I'm just so interested in it, right? Like I genuinely think that, yeah, like it's just like it's oh man, like as you can tell, like I'm just like feel like I'm almost breathless just trying to describe how good this was. This is one of those shows where, just for a little bit of context, for the viewers, I don't only watch anime. In fact, I would say that my TV viewing experience in general, a lot of it has been like outside of anime. But this is one of those where like I just know, like essentially after watching the final episode and like having it like kind of like watch like how it all plays together, like this is one where like I'm like, oh, like not it, in my opinion, transcends anime and is just like such an amazing storytelling that like it can punch like it can throw punches with someone like the heavyweights of what we would call like cinematic masterpieces by critics. Like I think that like it's genuinely like a very very just for within like the subject material that it's talking about. Like I think it's just like so crisply and well executed that, yeah, like we will talk about our feelings about who should be the Gauntlet champion and all that later. But yeah, like this is just honestly like just blew me out of the water. Like this is one of those shows where like after you watch the final episode, now it's like if I were to give episodes, all the previous episodes ratings, like it would be like elevated so much more because of kind of like the way that it all comes together, right? Obviously, like our ratings are meant to be like, oh, like when you watch it as a viewer and as you're watching through it, like how good is the episode. And so obviously like there's definitely value in that. But if you were to now kind of like take like a post-mortem look back and be like, oh, like like what are like the ratings, like man, like it's just like it builds, it adds so much more to like the series as a whole. It's like depth that is just, yeah, I don't know, I just can't stop ranting about how amazing this final episode was. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess for the sake of time, we should move on because
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
we still need to talk about the greats. We've talked about the greats.
Yeah.
They are now our Gauntlet survivors, and they'll be joining 86 and Way of the House Husband.
Survivors.
Unfortunately, we're still in the Gauntlet, so we still have to drop some shows. And unfortunately, these are the shows that are on the drop list. And so you can introduce the next one.
All right, To Your Eternity. Number 4 went up a spot. Manasa gave a score of 8.8. I gave it a score of 7. The rolling average has also now breached 5 and is now at 6.08. It went up by 0.17. This show, I will say that, knowing that it's going to have a very long runtime and this isn't like a finale, unlike the other shows, right? This isn't like a finale, so it doesn't have that level of like closure. It was like the closure to like a arc, I'd say, like like an arc. But Molly, this is a pretty good arc close. I'd say that like it's. I think that I didn't expect this episode to take that much, this much of a focus on like I guess like the emotional aspects of essentially like Gugu, his life, and kind of like like in the lives of those that surround him. But I do think that
Yeah.
it was quite well done. I'd say that like there's it definitely like like it's if you're the emotional type, I feel like you definitely would get some tears out on this episode because like it's just it feels like it's I think it was quite well executed. What did you think about this episode?
Yeah. Yeah. As if we were talking about how no, we were ready for like the end of the arc for
Yeah.
Gugu, and this was it. This is definitely the end. And I think in terms of the emotional impact, it was strong for what it was. I think because we spent so much time with Gugu's life,
Mm-hmm.
it was very intentional that this death and the way they portrayed the death too, because you noticed that Fushi was feeling
Yeah.
that a new spirit was
Yeah.
added to him, so he realized that Gugu was dying, and the whole
Mm-hmm.
relationship between Gugu and Reen was there as well, and
Yeah.
she realizes, at the end she knows that Gugu is
Yeah.
dead, but she's trying her best to like not talk about to
Yeah.
feel better.
Yeah.
I think, wow, I was like, Finally, I one of the reasons why I enjoyed this manga was moments
Okay.
like this.
Oh. Okay.
And yeah, and so there are more deeper, beautiful moments after
Yeah.
this, which I don't know if we're ever gonna watch this again for the Gauntlet, but
Yeah.
for those who are still watching, I definitely
Yeah.
recommend keep watching this,
Okay.
because I think it gets better,
Okay.
even
That.
better.
Okay. That's. I mean, that's great to hear. I think that it's. I will say that I am a little bit. There is definitely a yearning for me to kind of like see more of like the mechanics. I'd say that like part of me like was a little bit kind of like, okay, like it's kind of weird how he just like manages to beat the thing after like
Mm-hmm.
essentially kind of running their heads against the wall and like being like, oh, like like kind of didn't work. It just randomly like all of a sudden loses power. Like,
In the water.
yeah. So is it counted by water? Is that what it is? So if it's counted by water,
It
like
could
okay,
be.
okay,
Well,
it could
I
be.
don't want to
Okay,
spoil
okay,
anything,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
what we saw was that
yeah,
the knocker went into the water and it started to like crack.
yeah. So it's like, so part of me is wondering, like, oh, like how intelligent is this thing? If it's, essentially jumping into like a vat of its own weakness. I don't know, but I do think that the care that the show puts towards essentially explaining or exploring these emotional impacts will allow future episodes, right? Like moments like to carry just a lot more weight because you've done kind of like the homework, right? To put like to put these
Yeah.
storylines in place to provide more depth to actions. And so I'm also like incredibly like I just can't wait to like see like where this story goes. And I think that like I'm still, like I said, like I'll be honest, there's still a really big part of me that wants to see more of kind of like this Fushi being. Like I want to see that
Yeah.
play more into the world. I still think for the most part, up to this point, it's been kind of like, oh, here's this interesting thing, but for the most part, like it's not actually about like an immortal being that's using its powers a lot, like that type of stuff. Like that hasn't seemed to
Yeah,
be the focus. Yeah.
it's a slow ramp up,
Yeah.
and I
Mm-hmm.
think the reason why that is because he started off as some like non-conscious being,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he's still learning the ropes. But at least we passed the point where like he can talk and he can
Yeah.
feel, he can
Mm-hmm.
explain his feelings. I think
Yeah.
now that we're past that, whatever the next arc is, we actually will understand him more. At least that's what
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Guessing.
Yeah, guessing, yeah. But I mean, yeah. I think that this show, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to be doing Gauntlet wise, but like even if this doesn't end up being reviewed by our Gauntlet the next time around, like this will be a show that I just want to continue to watch just because like it's just, man, like I still think like overall like just like emotional pieces, storyboarding, even the visuals are like all of it's like the premise, all fresh enough to the point where it's just like I can't help but like continue to watch this because like it's a really cool, incredible thing, right? So
Yeah.
so yeah, not trying to say things too early, but this is one of those shows where like the scores have been ramping up so much that like it's basically only here because of its incredibly, shall I say, like in my opinion, suboptimally executed beginnings, but it has just been
Mm-hmm.
like it's been knocking out of the park quite handily in the last couple of in I would argue even like the latter half of the Gauntlet.
Yeah. Oh,
But yeah.
definitely.
But yeah, so that one is number 4.
Yeah.
The next one
And
on our
then
spot.
number
Yeah.
number 5 is Koikimo. I did not move a spot, which means it technically went down
Yeah.
because 86 is not here on the list. I get a score of 6.9. You get a score of 5. For rolling average of 6.02, so it went down by 0.01. This is one of the shows that also had just one episode. I think so for this episode,
Mm-hmm.
not really much happened until the end, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It was a
Yes.
lot of lead up to what
Yeah.
happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can confidently say that there will be no season 2.
Yeah.
I think this is the end of the story.
Yeah.
Essentially, at the end, they meet up at the same station,
Yeah.
and then I forget. Did she fall down this time and he saved her?
Yes.
Which is very,
Yes.
very
Yeah.
cliche slice of
Yeah.
life.
Mm-hmm.
They kissed, showed them they were kissing, which for me was a
Yeah.
very interesting
Yeah.
topic. And then they decide that they'll wait till she's older before they actually start dating.
Yeah. And
Which I think is the responsible choice.
okay, let me put it like this. I think that the show pretty much ignores this thing for the most part until the last couple of episodes. It finally comes into picture. I I personally have a slight immersion problem when it comes to kind of the actions of the male romantic lead. I think it's kind of interesting to me to think that somebody, okay, let me put it like this. The premise for him to have finally evolved beyond like a chasing and into like real love is suggesting that there was like a lot of connection between him and her. But just as like the show so aptly points out, like he's essentially been like the one accosting and chasing her like this whole time, and this is like the first time she's kind of reciprocated anything. And to me it's like, unless you're telling me that this dude like his entire life like has had no women actually kind of like show feelings for him, like, okay, yes, I get that, like technically he could have just been like, like just one night stand, move on, like that is kind of like how he was painted at the beginning of the show. But it's like, to me it's like the the shell shocking that comes from somebody being really into you, and essentially it all of a sudden like essentially boosting him from, like a guy who's literally hitting on some high schooler, right? Like, a guy who's doing that type of stuff and just like, doesn't know boundaries, all like to ascend to this level where like, obviously, I will say that I think that the social commentary of essentially, oh, like, you shouldn't be trying to decide what's best for others is very on the spot. I think that's a very good thing that a lot of East Asian shows, like the endings always happen because somebody decides, like essentially the male lead or the female lead like decides like, oh, like it's better if this doesn't happen, and they just leave somebody hanging and it's heartbreak, right? This theme is incredibly common, right? And I'd say that like I will give the show props for essentially kind of like taking a stab at that cliche and being like, hey, like at least kind of addressing it. But I did have, like I said, like some immersion problems, like thinking like, oh, like this guy essentially just went from who he was for basically the whole show to all of a sudden, like I said, like becoming this guy. What did you think of that?
That's interesting because I
Yeah.
I didn't. So the way I took it is yes.
Yeah.
So before his relationship with Ichika, the
Mm-hmm.
main character here,
Yeah.
all he's done has one night stands essentially,
Yeah.
and that's all he's kind of known.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think so now he's chasing after this girl,
Mm-hmm.
who's saying no to him. So, in my opinion, it's like that's one of the things that attracted him to it. Right in the beginning,
Yeah.
he was
It's
like
like, yeah.
being super nice, and she's like,
Mm-hmm.
"Nah, you're kind of creepy."
Yeah.
That which turns him on because I think he
Yeah. It's
just
like
not used to
the
rejection.
thrill. Yeah. The thrill of the hunt, right? Like type of thing.
Yeah, and so for me, in terms of his character, like he has slept around and no one has ever said no to him. And so now there's someone who says no to him, and he's trying to get her approval. He's worked so hard, and finally she's reciprocating, and now he's kind of at this point where it's like, oh, I didn't think this would happen. Um, and so the final episode is him saying that he'll ghost her because
Yeah.
I'm gonna cause all these problems, and then his buddy, who I think is a great
Yeah.
supporting character, is like,
Mm-hmm.
didn't you just tell me that you're okay
Yeah.
with like all the
Mm-hmm.
setbacks? Which I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, good.
Exactly.
I'm glad that he made this
Mm-hmm.
choice. So I'm glad for that. It didn't break my immersion because it was like, okay,
Okay.
that makes sense. If the guy who's so used to not being rejected is rejected, and if chases her for so long, right, this
Mm-hmm.
entire season, and finally has to come into terms like, oh, she's also reciprocating. What do I do now? Because now we actually have to talk about the age difference. Because if it's all just playing around, sure, it's inappropriate, but you're not like breaking anything. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So for me, I didn't break my
Okay.
immersion. The reason why I didn't give it like a high score
Yeah.
is like I don't like the fact that they're just stopping it there. Like I wish they could like
Yeah.
show more
Yeah.
about like the journey after that, because I
Mm-hmm.
think the journey after that is really important because that
Yeah.
really talks about the age difference, right?
Yeah. I think
And
that
so
it's.
without
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was like, without that, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I guess we're just here for the chase again, and that's what I was disappointed at.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that like it's to yeah. I think I also see your side of it. I think overall, right? I do think what we can conclude is that like essentially this show has kind of like this elephant in the room that finally kind of gets addressed, but that they never fully really delve into that at all, and the show just ends.
Yeah,
I will say, kind of like in retrospect, if you were to look at the entire series, it's still like a pleasant watch, and I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to assign too much gender norms on this, but I will say that okay, I guess for an audience that really likes to watch romantic focused content, I do think that this show deliver pleasantly in terms of like a viewing experience. Is not going to be something that's going to be like, oh, like
oh
you're going to think of.
really?
I
I
okay.
I actually don't think that if
Ooh,
you're a
a
watcher of
romantic. Okay,
romance, you'll
yeah.
like this, because I think if you're into romance
Yeah.
and all these like sweeping gestures, there's not that much of that in the show. Like there's moments for that, but it's not like if you're trying to compare the show to like an East Asian
Yeah.
romance TV show, very
Yeah.
different. You know what I mean? So I
Yeah,
don't think
it's
like
a lot
someone
more
who
subdued.
watches
Okay.
like K-drama, you're not gonna
Mhm.
watch this. Like you're not gonna, they're not the same.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, yes. I will agree and say that this show's a lot more subdued. I think that there isn't on the topic, I guess, to go back to immersion a little bit. There definitely wasn't anything that happened in the show that's just like so like stupidly telenovela or stupidly K-drama to the
Mhm.
point where I'm just like, dude, this is so dumb. Like there's no way this could happen. Like things like yes, like it's everything's just like well within reach of, should I say, believability.
Mhm.
Like, and I still I think that yeah, it's decent is like the best I'm like willing to give it. I think that given, okay, let me put it like this. Given the story that it had and what it like the material that it had, I think it did a very good job of working with what it had. That being said, I also do think that just like the general premise, the way the story goes, in my mind it's a little bit like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, this show has like absolutely perfect animations and like perfect like visuals, but like, let's say like the voice acting, all that type of stuff, like I do think that it was like done pretty well. And so, it's a pleasant, I think it's a pleasant show. I will say that yeah, I'm very disappointed that it just kind of ends here, right? And I think that like for a show that focuses this much on, or like the premise, right? The once again, like it's this elephant in the room that even the show is very aware of, that like this it's like this elephant in the room, like it never ends up really addressing it, which is to me it's like, oh, like if you're gonna talk about a show like this, like you're supposed to dive into the juiciness of this interesting facet, and it never really ends up doing that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts you want to add to it?
No, not really.
Okay, alrighty. And at number 6 we have Tokyo Revengers. Technically went up by 2 spots. Manasa gave a score of 6.5. I gave a score of 7. The rolling average is 5.74. And it went up by 0.09. This essentially ends the arc that they were currently in. I personally thought it was okay. I'm gonna put it like this. Do I sometimes have frustrations with shows that like kind of like much ado about nothing type of thing? Technically, yes. Okay, there are plenty of shows like even within the context of our Gauntlet, right? Like whatchamacallit, like Duran, to a certain degree, like Mars Red. Like there are shows where like, oh, if it goes around like way too much and it feels like, oh, like consequentially not too much has happened, does it feel kind of shitty? It does. But I do think that in terms of this show, I thought it was great, and I wanted this to kind of happen because it's like, oh, telling me that like, oh, like, essentially, okay, let me put it like this. I think that the premise of a time traveling person, one person able to go into the past and retain his memories, is so interesting. But at the same time, the flip side of it is like, what do you think as one person? Do you really think you're gonna be able to actually change the entire world? And that feeling of helplessness that he encounters, right? Like, and I still think that like, like it's a great way to provide even more emotional depth to him, right? While essentially also being able to essentially, it's almost like a cheat card because of the way the story's being told, right? You're gonna develop this character even more and then send him back again. Like this time it's like even more different lenses, right? It's like this character that's evolved even more. Let's
More.
put him in the same
Oh
scenario.
yeah.
Yeah, right? It's incredible. Like I was like, yo, this is like actually
Yeah,
nice. Like, yeah.
the new premise for him, because he thought the
Yeah.
premise was just need to stop Draken's
Yes.
death and we're
Yeah.
good to go. Hina still dies, and
Yeah.
he tells himself it's not the
Yeah.
choice that
Yeah.
his Hina's brother told him to do,
Yeah.
right? His choice now is the only way to save Hina is if I am the leader of Toman.
Yeah.
That
Exactly.
is the only way. If I
Yeah.
rule Tokyo, essentially, I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. It's like, oh
okay, like
shit.
that's
Yeah.
progress. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, and like you go from like essentially a kid who I'm sure he's not gonna just immediately transcend this, but like a kid who's like
Yeah.
a crybaby that like doesn't do jack shit and like is just super hopeless and has to like literally get into a life death situation before he's like, oh, I need to stand up for myself. Going from that to essentially, oh, becoming king of Toman, like shit, like there's gonna be a lot of
It's
like
funny you say
journey.
crybaby because
Yeah.
that's the title of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
opening song.
it's yeah, exactly, right? It's like, oh, like I think that like I will say that like just individually the episode by itself wasn't like anything incredible, but like looking
Yeah,
forward, like
yeah.
man, like was this like a I find this like incredibly satisfying. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh shit, like this is
So
gonna yeah.
it's funny because so it's this show and To Your Eternity
Yeah.
that are continuing.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked before about how
Yeah,
we're probably not gonna continue
yeah.
them, but like a small part of me is like, oh, but
I
these
want to.
two
Yeah,
shows
are
I
so
want
good.
to
Yeah,
continue.
yeah. Like they're so good that like I feel like they'd be like good conversation pieces. You know, good material for the podcast for people to continue to talk about it. And honestly, you know, like we have a little bit of time to brainstorm, so we'll see.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah. Anyways, like I think that the episode by itself doesn't do anything incredible, but I'm
correct.
like so like just looking forward to what happens next. That
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
You know, credit to where credit is due, and I do think that this one, if I remember correctly, also ends up being one of like the, shall we say, aggregate favorites, and I think for a good reason, because you know, like I
yeah.
do think that like yeah, shit, like this is incredible. It's like it's the edge, it's the coolness of being able to have like a fresh premise, right? And like they're
Mm-hmm.
doing a really good job with this premise, and yeah, I like can't wait to see where it goes. So yeah, Tokyo Revengers at number 7.
Is Shadow's House. It is staying at number 7. I get a score of 5, which is my lowest score of this week, and a
Yeah.
5.5. You get a score of 6 and 6 for rolling average of 5.71, down by 0.02. So for me, why
Yeah.
did I give it the lowest score? I don't think. Okay, so since 5 is not really a low
Okay.
score, it's
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
middle score.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why I gave it a low score is primarily because episode 12, not really much
Yeah. Not
happens.
not not a lot happens. Yeah.
She gets kidnapped and she's like being like she's being interrogated by Edward, who's trying
Yeah.
to get out a confession,
Hmm.
and that's it. And so it's like, okay, at least with the Tokyo Revengers, it's like there's an interesting premise
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
next,
Hmm.
right? But this one
Yeah.
didn't really have anything, so that's why
Yeah.
I gave it a low score of 5.
Okay.
But I noticed that you gave it double sixes.
Yeah. Which is actually considering. So let me put it like this: versus the rest of the shows that are surviving, it's not that high of a score. But a 6 is a pretty good score, and I do think that like, I think okay. Let me put it like this. Maybe this is something that I will have to admit happened. I essentially kind of lost hope on this show doing anything extremely revolutionarily speaking, like storytelling wise.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's kind of just like, it's gonna be like, oh no, big evil, and like you know, like a little bit, a bunch of kids like trying to do something. Like I kind of lost hope for it to have like an edge. And I think that just contained within, shall I say, like, oh, finishing out what you would be expected on par of the story to be, like, I think it was, like, decently executed. I think
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, the way, like, I will say that, like, there's a tiny part of me that's like, oh, like, punch the wall to regain your manliness. I did think it was really adorable to see, like, how Emilico was, like, saying, like, oh, yeah, I'm not hungry anymore. It's just, like, a really childish, like, sunshine. Once again, they kind of, like, it's like
Yeah.
it doesn't do anything like crazy like but it's like, oh, like the things that it does have going for it, I do think like it's executed pretty well. I think that
Mm-hmm.
like the ambitions of Edward and kind of like this whole thing, it's given, okay, I think given within my expectations, I think it was executed almost as well as it could have been. That being said, I will admit that like once again, like this is a show where it's just like it has like a gothic flair to it, right? It has like some elements going for it, but like it's literally that. And like I won't be lying when I say that like this is one of the slower shows. I think the only show that I can confidently say was actually slower than this entire time, in my opinion, was Super Cub, which is literally like a feels like a, you know what I mean, like that type of a genre. Like it's actually like a
Mm-hmm.
different genre entirely. I will say that like man, like it's like your description of like how like almost nothing happens in this penultimate episode is like it's so true. Like if you really thought about it, like let's type out what happens and like whatchamacallit, like a little story chart. There will be like almost nothing that happens, right? And I think
Yeah.
that is kind of like that's kind of like the thing as that's kind of the thing of the show as a whole, right? It's that like if you want to watch this and enjoy this, I think you do have to just have like a really big draw and desire to see this stylization. I think like at the end of the day, like that's kind of like the best that it's going for. Looking back, like it was like I'll be honest. This was one of the shows that did not continue to just kind of be like, oh, I really want to find what happens on next. There's a reason why this show had to have a save, right? Because like you know, I genuinely just like wasn't really feeling it. Like I felt like it's just kind of like, oh, like if you have absolutely nothing else to watch and you almost like just by faith by merit of needing to complete a show, you just continue to trudge forward. It's like it's not bad, but I do think that like you know like it's just in retrospect, it seems like you know it's a very dragged out piece. It has like some of its has some nice parts, but
Yeah,
also like
a part of me thinks that
yeah,
a part of pacing issues for
yeah,
me has always been like where in the manga they want to stop, and it seems
okay,
like they wanted to stop earlier, but because they
yeah,
stopped earlier, they need to extend. Because the
yeah,
same thing
okay,
happened with To Your Eternity, the first
yeah,
episode.
okay, yeah,
One manga chapter they
yeah,
extended to one episode, so I
yeah,
wonder if this has the same problem. I
yeah.
did write here though in the notes. So I put here what an ending. What happened at the ending of this episode of the last episode?
So number one, we find out that essentially the kids are like they essentially get to kind of like ascend to like the whatever being a part of the Shadow Society. Those kids they are able to.
Oh
We
yeah,
see
yeah.
that Rum is actually now a maid, and this is like context of
Mm-hmm.
saying that like oh like the failed ones become a maid, and Rum was the one
Yeah.
that like sent that little thingamajig. We do see kind of like the turmoils between Edward and like the other fourth chambered or third
Yeah.
chambered people already. There's kind of like some drama there, and then we also do have a scene of essentially the new regular people of society drinking the coffee and like kind of like starting anew, right? Technically, I don't think that they're gonna do this, but technically they could restart the entire story and just talk about this new set of people again and just like take us essentially through this season all over again because we now see like the new recruits, right? That was what the
Gotcha.
ending
Yeah.
was. Essentially like it does
Yeah.
have some setup for like the next season because like oh like grandpa like old grandfather being like very not quite omniscient, but like approaching that level, like it adds like a level of
Yeah.
like interestingness to it. But yeah, that was the ending. Essentially, it kind of sets up for season two, or slash future episodes. But yeah, that's Shadow's house. Alrighty. For the next show, is this a bottom show? Let me think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yep.
This would
That's
be
the last show.
And the last show we have Mars Red. Technically went up one spot only by the merit of essentially Vivi. I mean, not of Vivi. 86 no longer being
86.
here. Mars Red went up one spot to be our number 8. Manasa gave a score of 5.3, and then a 5.8. I gave a score of 5, and then a 4, which is the lowest score of the week. My lowest score of the week, and the lowest score of the week. And the rolling average dropped down by 0.08 to get to 5.44. Let me put it like this. I was expecting 2 shows to end up expending a lot of my energy. Like, I had so much pent-up energy to talk about. One of them was Odd Taxi, which I just legitimately think was like, man, this shit is like, this like I said, like genre transcending stuff, like just amazing. This is the other one. I think that this is, and obviously in the other direction. As you guys may have observed, all you listeners may have observed, for most of the Gauntlet series, I was kind of the one pulling for this show. Like, I think I was the one that gave a little bit higher ratings. Overall, on average, I think that I was always the one who was like, oh, just look at it within like a historical drama timepiece lens right now. I was like always willing to kind of give it the benefit of the doubt. And my question is kind of like, if this is actually essentially what the play was, like who thought it was a good idea to actually adapt this into an anime? Because like, I think, okay, for example, right, the final scene where you finally see their vampire like circles intertwine, like could that be kind of cool to see in a play? Sure, but like there's just so little substance that ends up happening that I'm just kind of like, this is truly okay. After I think Jerron wins the prize for Much Ado About Nothing. This comes like at like a close second. Okay, okay, obviously for the shows that remained a decent amount of time for us to be able to give that assessment. But yeah, this one like ends up like pretty close over there, right? Like, why is your focus now on what's the other guys? So it's Maida, and then who's the other guy in the poster? Essentially, the person's.
Shotaro.
Yeah, Shotaro.
Shotaro.
Why
Shutaro.
is Shutaro? Why does the focus end up being on Shutaro? This is underdeveloped character. All of a sudden, like starts like developing things right at the end of the show. It's like, who gives a like? It's like why? Like why?
Yeah.
Like,
Okay. So we've been saying that too, but
Yes.
if you actually watch from the beginning, Shutaro has always been the central character. It's just Maida's story was a bit more captivating earlier on.
Mm-hmm. And like, yeah, and here's the thing, right? Like, so if you were to look back and technically look at, let's say, like, oh, in the frame, who's in the middle, or like, like who has more screen time, I actually wouldn't be surprised if Shutaro is supposed to be the main character. It speaks to the quality of the story when, despite this much screen time, we feel like we know nothing about it. In fact, I would say out of all the characters, we know the least about. Okay, so out of the characters in the poster, outside of the scientist, I feel like I knew the least about him. Okay, coming into this final episode, like there's just like emotional setup and stuff like that. Sure,
Interesting.
okay,
I would say the least would be the white-haired guy, in my opinion.
Oh, the white hair guy. Okay, so the white hair guy, at least in my opinion, like that that he had the one episode kind of dedicated to him of like the hooker and like the
Yeah.
immortality thingamajig, and I do think like his interactions with some of the kids, like I felt like it gave it like at least some substance. I genuinely felt like before these episodes, like I like knew the less about Shutaro. Obviously now, if I were to look back, which I'm gonna be honest, I'm not very motivated to do so, but if I were to go look back and like kind of like maybe there was a little bit more substance, I do think that like more of what we see from Shutaro is actually from the perspective of, is that his little sister or who is that exactly? That
Her
like
childhood friend.
his childhood friend that cares for him a lot. I think we know more about him through her lens than like through him himself. Anyways, I just think it's like it's kind of one of those things where it's like, dude, like now looking back at it, it's just like, man, like you had like this incredibly epic setup, right? Okay, let's first tackle everything else out of the way. Okay, the way that Danny Boy's thing gets like, I feel like it's like the show tries to give itself so much credit for being like, oh, this guy's called Danny Boy, and Danny Boy's supposed to be about this, you know, this serene guy who has it all. And look at the contrast of how what a frantic, like egotistical guy he is. And this is, and the performer eventually keeps on rubbing the Danny Boy side into like, you know, the fact that his name is Danny Boy kind of like makes it like a central part of the dialogue. You're supposed to see the contrast and be like, oh damn, like, you know, like the futility of struggle, right? It's supposed to be highlighted, okay? Like that being said, like incredibly, like okay, from like a dramatic sense point, it's like okay, like it's kind of like it's dramatic. I'll give it like the literary credit, but like it's just like it feels like it's so unsatisfying. Like who gives a shit? It's kind of like the way I kind of feel like the rest of the story is all unfold, right? It's like oh, like the fact that like oh, like now like Japan's gonna try to like do this, like the soldiers are working like this, like it just feels like everything else, right? Like oh, like the inn owner, the way that they like finally decide to like they focus so much time on like making that little freaking Batman like the contraption thingamajig, and like I just
Yeah.
like had like such a big like I don't give a shit about like it just like it felt like it's like trying to wrap them up like didn't end up doing a lot. Okay, and what you did focus on in terms of the show, right? In my opinion, the biggest focus was on essentially the idea of a play, and they did that through the childhood actor. Wait, what's his name again? The actor from England, the vampire actor. What's
Oh,
his name again?
a defraud.
A defraud, yeah. So the defraud ends up being like you know like the in story narrator, right? He sets this whole thing up. He's the one like at the middle of the season that frames this thing as kind of like oh like this is a tragedy, right? And it's like it's kind of like it's cool to see because it's like oh like this level this extra layer he puts on. You put this much of your show's focus on kind of like the tragedy aspects of it. Why not lean into it all the way? And I feel like it's like oh like essentially from both what we were saying, right? It's like oh like we would incredibly want to see Maida's story actually get wrapped up a lot more solidly because this is what you set up, right? It's like oh this whole incredible thing, and then like Maida essentially gets around 5 seconds of developmental screen time, and then just and then like it's like okay maybe not 5 seconds but like 30 seconds, right? And then just like and it's just like dude like what the shit, man. Like it feels like it's like at the end when you look at it it's kind of like what was the point. And like sure I guess that like if you were to technically take a step back and look at plays, okay, specifically we're going to talk about this as a play for a little bit because this was technically based on a play. If you were to like take a look back at a play, a lot of plays aren't supposed to like leave you with like a sense of like profound wonderment and be like oh man that like really changed my world. Like it's kind of supposed to be like a contained story where like oh you felt enjoyable to watch it. That being said, since this is an anime podcast and we are rating it as anime, I will say that like man I just felt like it just translated horribly and I was just so dissatisfied with it. What are your I've been rambling on a lot as you can tell like but yeah, what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's funny because the moment I felt like Maeda-san was not the main
Yeah.
character, like because it was like 2 or 3 episodes of him not
Yeah.
showing up. I already gave up on Maeda-san. I focused on the
Okay.
other characters, so it was less. I think it was less unenjoyable. I actually enjoyed
Okay.
some of the moments because I remember you talking about earlier on in the Gauntlet how you thought that the show was a lot of like big drama moments that are
Yes.
just escalating.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
I kind of framed my
Yeah.
viewing of the last 2 episodes as that. And I was like,
Mhm.
man, this is actually, there's a lot of great moments here, but they just don't pay off because they don't have
Yes.
the
Yeah.
context or the building up for it. And I
Mhm.
think going back to what I said earlier with Vivi is a great example of how to create moments, have moments that lead up to other moments, and at the
Mhm.
end, look back and say, wow, what a journey. I've
Yeah.
felt all of
Mhm.
these moments led up
Yes.
to this.
Mhm.
Mars Red was supposed to be like that.
Yeah, it's supposed to be.
If you
Yes.
look at it
Yeah.
in its entirety, lots
Yeah.
of big moments led to the battle between Shutaro
Yeah.
and Maeda-san.
Yeah.
Uh, and if you look at it that lens, I think what they were trying to do is portray this beautiful scene where it's like, wow, it's him versus two different kinds of people
Yeah.
with two different backgrounds and perspectives on the vampire race.
Yeah.
But there was no building up to that moment
Yeah.
at all. The moment itself was cool to have that
Yes.
battle, like this epic scene.
Mm-hmm.
However, there was really no characterization. There was no
Yes.
plot progression.
Yeah.
It felt empty. So
Yes.
that's the contrast from Vivi. Vivi felt
Yeah.
full at the end, whereas
Yeah.
Mars Red was like, I don't remember what the show was really about anymore. Like,
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah,
why are
it's
these
like,
guys fighting?
yeah, it's like it's much ado about nothing, right? It's like where it's like, for example, like I like I said, like I'm just so curious about like how this show was as like a play and like the source material, because like I said, like yeah, it's like you talked about, right? Like there's actually some pretty epic moments, right? Like I actually think the whole Defraud versus Danny Boy thing, actually think that was pretty dramatic.
Cool,
and I was like, yeah, I was like, oh
just need
shit, yeah, exactly, right? It's like I felt like it's like if we were to look at it within the context of itself, like I said, like the fact that I was able to talk about that moment for a solid like 2 minutes, right? And then there was a lot of substance behind that scene, right? There's
Yeah.
like I said, like sure, like part of it is like, you know, like the choice, you're supposed to have some outside knowledge about Danny Boy and specifically the song, what it's supposed to be about, but like it's like it ends up being like kind of like a deep moment, but it's just like it comes out of left field, and like even if in the moment of itself you're kind of like, oh wow, like this is kind of deep, like, and there is kind of a lot there, it doesn't affect the rest of the story. You didn't get built up to it, and so it just feels like it's like a powerful shot that missed the target, right? That's kind of like the best feel I have for it. Like,
Yeah, I definitely agree.
alrighty. So with that, we have the drop list over here. And
Yeah.
if I recall
We
correctly,
are on week 12.
Yeah.
So I get to choose first,
Yes.
which is amazing because I
Yeah.
think there's one.
yeah.
Okay, let's just name
Yeah.
the list
Okay.
per routine. So it's To Your Eternity, Koi Kimo, Tokyo Revengers, Shadow's House, and Mars Red.
Yeah.
And I have the honor of dropping the lowest one, which I think is a cut below the rest, which is
Yeah.
going to be Mars Red.
Yeah.
I think Mars Red was just, unfortunately, it did not deliver the substance, and will be dropped. And it's
Yeah.
now your turn.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say that despite being the person that really wanted it to be good, I fully agree with that. Like I said, like I just feel like at the end, it's like you really look back and it's like much ado about nothing, and not in a good way, right? Like it's just actually literally much ado about nothing type of feel. I will say that out of these shows that remain, I'm gonna be dropping Shadow's House. I think that this was the other show that I think kind of had an offender of just being like so much runtime for not enough stuff. I will say it's not nearly as bad as Mars Red, because at least it's still kind of like consistently trudged it forward like a little bit. Like I'm gonna be honest, like Mars Red, about like a third of the episode were like straight blank shots that were just like, dude, like I did not need to watch this, like type of crap. Like, but like with this show, I also do feel like it's kind of like, let me put it like this: the premise in of itself isn't also just like that compelling either. Like if you really think about it, it's like, oh, here's like, you know, some mysterious people who are, you know, there's it's like a caste, it's a caste system, all that type of stuff, and that's like pretty much it. Like what's gonna actually happen for the rest of the show? It's gonna be, oh, a big bunch of people, a big bunch of little kids trying to like figure out the ways to like screw over like the larger ones, advance their own agenda. But it's like, it's just like there isn't like, think back on it, like for what it had executed decently, which is why I think it survived this long. But like the substance just isn't as much there. In contrast to these other shows, I think that like Tokyo Revengers and To Your Eternity, obviously these weren't season finales, but like, man, is there like, the premise is just like, the premise and like the storytelling is good enough to the point where you're like, man, I want to keep watching it. But yeah, Shadow's House is gonna be my pick, which means now for our survivors, our remainders, let me do a quick refresh. Okay, so as a remainder, these are our Gauntlet Survivors. Going from, I guess, the top left, so we have 86, To Your Eternity, with the House Husband, Koikumo, the Snow White Notes, Odd Taxi, Tokyo Revengers, and Vivi.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a solid remainder.
Yeah, it's a great first graduating class,
Yeah.
essentially, for us. And so that technically is the end of the regular season of the
Yeah.
Gauntlet. If you go on to the next slide,
Okay.
you see the schedule.
Yeah.
So tonight we had 8 shows. We dropped 2. We said last week that this week was going to be our last episode. However, we are going to have one more the following week, which is the award show. where we go through and give out the awards. And if you go to the next slide, we'll just briefly talk about what the awards so kind of entails.
Yeah.
Go to the next slide. Here are the categories for the awards that we'll be giving out next week. Best opening sequence, which is just the best sounding OP. Best ending sequence, best sounding ED. Best score, so the music that is in the episodes in the anime. Best main character, best supporting character, best VA performance is VA is short for voice actor. So whoever gave the best voice performance,
Yeah.
best fight sequence, best moment, best writing, best first episode, best episode, best animation, and then the coveted Gauntlet runner-ups and Gauntlet champions. If you go on to the next slide, we'll talk about the format of the Gauntlet Awards. It's a little bit easier. So only Gauntlet survivors are eligible for these awards. There will be one champion award and two runner-ups. The way we determine a champion is to get that. So we have the rankings that we got from the Gauntlet per episode, but we are actually going to be compiling a list of our personal rankings after the fact. So it could be very different from what's going on. So we're gonna average those, and the highest one will be the champion. The runner-ups will be the next highest scores for each of our personal rankings. So it's not gonna be the aggregate anymore. If there is a tie, then if you go on to the next one, then the tie would just be the next highest average ranking. And these are specifically for the Gauntlet Awards. For all other awards, they will follow this format. Open to all shows, even the shows that are limited. Just because they don't necessarily have to be, in the
solid
Gauntlet.
show overall to still have, for example, the best opening, right? Like it's like
exactly
all still eligible.
Yeah. So the process for that is we're gonna make a list of all the candidates, and then rank all the candidates personally. From 1 to whatever number. The top 16 average will advance to a bracket, 1 versus 16, single elimination. And then we just rank all the candidates every round, see who the winners are, and eventually we will have the champion. There will be 4 awards: the winner, the runner-up, and just the honorable mentions. And if you want to participate in the voting, then you can definitely do that if you join our Discord community. The way we're doing this is we as the podcasters have a higher weight to it, but your votes still matter.
Alrighty. So yeah. There's a close. It's a close to our anime watching. The awards. We need to crown a Gauntlet champion and some other awards that'll come next week. But yeah. Overall, I'd say, man, was this a great show. A great showing. I think. There was definitely some weak participators early on, but there are also some incredible ones, and I think that the graduating class, it speaks to, I think, the quality of it. And yeah, I mean, it's a solid graduating class, and yeah, tune in next week to see what our personal, what we thought was the best, right? That's kind of the point of it. Voice your agreements, your disagreements, and all that. That'll all be there in our next episode. But yeah. This is, it's been great, and I personally can't wait for the next Gauntlet. But I think it'll be great. And now that we have this first one under our shoes, a little bit more familiarity of the format and all that. But yeah, definitely tune in next week. I think that it'll be fun. They'll probably more likely than not, you get to see some disagreements, some agreements, and put yourself up against put your own perspective up against it, right? And definitely let us know, do you agree, do you disagree, all that type of stuff. But yeah, that's going to be wrapping up this episode of the Gauntlet, and yeah, definitely tune in next week. It'll be the awards show, and who doesn't love awards? Alrighty. And that'll be it. All right, peace.
Peace.